Hi, I'm Ken Hale, and I want to talk to you today about three special reports that I've written. One is called Defective Lease Provisions for a Tenant. The other one is Issues Relating to Purchasing Insurance for a Landlord on the Tenant's Insurance Policy. And the third one talks about adding landlords as additional insured on the tenant's liability policy. So these reports are quite extensive. However, the problem is that we know that most business owners will lease a building from someone else from time to time. However, the risk of loss provisions, that is, the provisions that deal with what happens if this building burns down, are not dealt with adequately by attorneys or by landlords because they really don't have a good knowledge of the insurance provisions of their insurance policy as it relates to damage to a building that you're leasing from somebody else. So this first paper talks about these provisions, and there are two important things that we look at in a lease. The first provision is what happens if the tenant does something wrong and the building burns down? Well, what could happen is that the landlord's insurance company will sue the tenant to get the money back. The tenant will say, well, I have liability insurance. The liability insurance on my general liability policy covers property damage liability. Makes sense. The only problem is there's an exclusion on the liability policy that says we're not going to cover damage to anything you lease from anyone else. So there's no liability insurance that's going to cover this building damage, and it could be multi-millions of dollars. So the first thing we look at is, in the event the tenant is negligent, will the lease require that the tenant repay the landlord or the landlord's insurance company? The second thing we look at is, even if it is not the tenant's fault, the lease could have a provision under the repair clause that requires that the building be rebuilt, even if it's an act of God, such as a tornado that damages the building. So we want to look at all of these clauses and try to remove these clauses to begin with in order to avoid that type of catastrophe that could happen if you're sued by a landlord or the landlord's insurance company and you have no insurance. So that's one special report. We've given you some suggested provisions on how you can deal with this. The second one is really quick. In many what we call net-net leases, the landlord requires that the tenant buy the landlord's insurance on the building and put it on the tenant's policy. This is a very dangerous thing to do for both the landlord and the tenant and should never be done, but is quite often done. So read that report. The third one relates to the requirement in most leases that the landlord be added as additional insured to the tenant's insurance policy for liability claims, so that if there's a slip and fall in the tenant's office, that the tenant's policy will defend the landlord. Most landlords rely on that and do not buy their own liability insurance. This talks about why that is a bad practice. Landlords should always have their own independent liability insurance. So those are three special reports that relate to leases. I mean, these are important. I hope you read them. And if you have any questions after reviewing our special report, feel free to call me. My phone number and my email address are on the website, and I'd be happy to take your call or to respond to your emails.